Boker Tov, everyone. Boker Tov L'chulam. It is a few days before the Seder, literally 2 days. Tuesday, April 7th. I am Rabbi Eric Solomon, talking some Torah here, morning Torah from Raleigh, North Carolina, once again. And this morning, sadly, life and death is on the brain. We now have our first funeral in our congregation for someone thankfully did not die of COVID-19, but as all clergy are dealing with during this time, still this person was a very meaningful, important person in our community. All are, but this person brings up in this moment, really raises for us all of the complexities and complications and our inability to fulfill the basic mitzvot and commandments of our tradition regarding burial, which we have numerous, very powerful, meaningful, long-standing traditions about burial, funeral practices, the sitting of Shiva, and all these things are, modified and to some degree halted, which is painful and difficult. And I myself am struggling with them and how to work this out and how to communicate them to the family. It's this is really where clergy 101 of what it means to really struggle and communicate this information and still bring comfort in this challenging time. Some of you probably listening to this have been dealing with this as well. So life and death is on the brain for me this morning as we approach Pesach. And in this crisis, so is life and death too. So we're hearing increasing numbers. I heard yesterday in the news recently that sadly so many have died in New York City. They're considering at one point burying people in Central Park or in public parks. Sounds like that's not going to happen, but this idea of the number of people dying and clergy, doctors facing that, it's overwhelming. It's hard to imagine in like a non-wartime setting, what we are doing or what we may have to do. Deeply upsetting. And then, of course, Passover itself, Pesach, it doesn't shy away from issues of life and death, both within the story and the risks to life and those who do die in the course of the story, in the course of plagues. It's a living issue. And so what I want to do is bring up two examples of life and death and their teachings in the Seder and in the Pesach story, which I hold as, I think, being so critical to defining kind of the Jewish take on death, dying, funerals, like kind of overall, because we have so many practices around funerals and Jewish law. In my view, extraordinary meaningful practices about Shiva and the way it should be done, about simplicity, about the prayers recited, the mourner's Kaddish, etc. So here are my two pieces. The first is about the Seder. In the Seder, on the light side, is right after the meal is complete, we have 4 cups of wine or juice at the Seder. But there's actually a debate in the Talmud, should there be a 5th cup? Each one of those cups is connected to a verse in the Torah that talks about our salvation, about our hope. And we have a cup of wine to designate and kind of remind ourselves of hope in the midst of our slavery, that God promised us that eventually we would be freed. And we celebrate with the cups of wine. Totally appropriate. But there's debate on one particular verse. Was it a promise? Was it not? It's not worth going into a big detail here. In the end, the rabbis decide it's a teku, it's a tie, not clear. So designate a 5th cup of wine at the Seder, that 5th cup, for Elijah. And the idea that Elijah, Eliyahu a prophet, Eliyahu a Navi, will come in and we'll see if he will drink from that cup of wine. We put it in the middle of the table. And if he does, then the Messiah means Messiah is coming, because our tradition says when Elijah comes back, he will herald the Messiah. And as many families know, it's the time when you open the door, you sing Eliyahu Hanavi, you see, and then amongst the kids, it's cute. As I was a kid, my grandfather, rest in peace, my Zadie, would maybe take a quick sip, and all the kids looking, we go to the door, come back, run to see a little bit, had it gone down, did that mean it's coming, what happened, did my grandpa take some, what happened there. It's a very cute tradition. But underneath it, underneath that idea is not only a pining for the Mashiach and a pining for better times, but there's this idea that we're opening the door and we're praying that someone will come in and join our table that isn't at our table. And just to make it more specific, the idea that there may be someone who's been sitting at our table for years, and then one year is no longer sitting at our table. And in fact, every year of sitting down at the table is both about celebrating who's around our table, and that may include new friends and new people, and inviting guests you don't know, which, that is a specific mitzvah, is to invite people you don't know, including people who are not Jewish. But the tradition that we sit every year at a table around the Seder, eat these special meals with our people, so to speak, means that one day there will be some people that won't sit around this table. And so the Passover Seder is filled with this mixed feeling, both a celebration that we're together and a sadness that there's a spot at the table where someone's missing. And when we open the door and we want someone to come in, some of us, it's not just waiting for Elijah the prophet, it's perhaps waiting for that grandparent who used to sit, maybe even lead the Seder, and is not sitting there anymore. Or a relative who sadly is deceased or ill. And this year, when we can't really sit on the table in normal ways, I know we'll use Zoom and other technology, and I say kol hakavod for that. I totally support that, particularly this year. At least we'll have that context. This will be a Passover Seder. Seder is not to forget, but it will be different. It will be different. But that concept that every ritual, every tradition is about who's there, it's about who's not there. At a wedding, it's about who's around the chuppah, but it's also who's not around the chuppah at the same time. Brings life and death into the same moment. So I invite you to think about that, by the way, when you open the door for Elijah. You're hoping for Eliyahu, please God, for peace, but who else would you wish could walk through that door? Sometimes at our Seders, people cry right at that moment, thinking about that idea more than any other time in the Seder, more than the maror, the bitter herbs. And I want to bring it to another example just like this. One of the teachings, this is like one of my favorite teachings. If I say all my teachings are favorite, but about Moshe. We have such deliberate and lengthy and serious, beautiful traditions about burial, levayot, about funerals, shiva. There's psycho-spiritual wisdom to how it goes, the process, the simplicity, the length, the idea that you are supposed to be sad, that crying occurs, that happens quickly. This is that you're surrounded by family and friends. A lot of these things have to be modified in this current crisis. But one of them is the actual burial itself, that we bury the body. Please God, we have remains. We take the soil, actually place it on the body and cover it. Really getting in touch and facing realities of death. We place a stone, a matzeva, simplicity, plain pine box. Tradition is not to, as much as they are beloved, as successful as we're in business, as much as they overcame in their lives, everyone, simplicity, the idea that your resources shouldn't go into making some fancy coffin. You say, let their resources, let money, go towards their legacy. From dust we come, from dust return. So there's a lot there, and I can give a whole Devar Torah on that. But let's come back to why I'm bringing it up here, about Moshe, about Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu. We know the story. Moshe leads us through all the travails of the promised land, dealing with our people. We're fetching. Some want to go back. They say the leeks and onions were good. He says, he's so upset. Golden calf. Many times he's frustrated, big time. So is God. But he leads us ultimately to the promised land. In that infamous moment when the people complain for water, and you can imagine how frustrated he is. We're getting closer, and God says, okay, speak to the rock will bring you water, and he hits the rock twice. And according to the Torah, because he hit the rock twice, even though water did come out, that's why he was denied the right to enter the promised land, which itself is a whole other of our Torah. Seems unfair. But commentators talk about he lost his cool. He used violence. He in this moment of leadership, he began to falter. And perhaps it was a demonstration that he was He maybe even say like kind of a burned out. So the consequence is tough. To get to the mountaintop, to look into the promised land, see all its beauty, to run all the way, and not be allowed to enter. And on that side of Har Nevo, he dies. And of all of our biblical characters, all our Torah characters, we know, technically, Avraham, Sarah, Rachel, Leah, Yaakov, we know where all these people are buried. It describes where they're buried. And only one character, how is it possible to be? Moshe, it says, no one knows where he is buried. And it seems so troubling given all the tradition we have in the Torah, afterwards in rabbinic literature, up this very day. Matzeva, grave marker, visits, yard site. I mean, this is all anachronistic, but the idea that we have so much to value, how can we not know where Moshe is buried? This is makes no sense of all characters. And some biblical scholars will explain to you, and it comes up in the Haggadah. The Haggadah barely, I think it mentions Moshe's name once or not at all. There's a concern amongst the rabbis as the Seder evolves that people will look to Moshe as a god and forget Adonai. So that's a kind of concern going on. And even there's a midrash early on, when my favorite midrashim talks about this idea that when the people were suffering at any time after Moshe was dead, they wanted to go to Moshe's grave and ask for his help. But they couldn't find it. It's kind of a moment of maturity. Almost a sense perhaps the Torah is saying that we can't have people running to Moshe all the time. At some point, the people have to move on. But still, it begs the question, why is there no place for Moshe where he's buried? Just out of respect. Just the basic Jewish law, Jewish practice, as it evolved, is that when someone dies, it's considered respect to return them back to the earth. And, what my answer that I've evolved over time, and this is based on other commentators too, is that Moshe is a unique person. That he's not buried in a place. I mean, he is buried. It didn't say he's not buried. It just says you don't know where he's buried. He's buried. It's just not sure where. Because the truth is he's buried in our hearts. He's buried in every member of the Jewish people. He's buried in every person who's ever studied this story, Jewish or not Jewish. His life has influenced Western civilization. His story has been the story of all peoples striving for freedom and liberation in all times. Imagine it. A man who resisted taking the leadership helm, who struggled being a leader, who had a physical disability, a speech impediment, ends up being, and one who, technically you could say sinned by hitting the rock. He still is remembered for eternity because he's buried in here. And he's buried in here because of his actions, because of his selflessness, because of his willingness to not be perfect, but the willingness to give of himself, to give of all of himself, to save others, speak truth to power, to stand up for justice, to protect his people. Such an important message for us. All of us, please God, I want to practice the Jewish tradition. I don't think this is no excuse. This is the exception makes the rule. Please God, we should live long lives, buried in Hebrew cemeteries, traditional rituals, with a marker. So important. Times in Jewish history, like during the Shoah, we don't know where everyone's buried. It's so enormously painful for people not have a place to go to honor those people we've lost. A place matters. We deserve a place. But the greatness of a person is not just about how glorious or big their, God forbid, coffin is, or their matzeva, how we don't do that. It's about the influence they had in our heart. And Passover is a time to tell the people we love and to share with them what we think is in our heart. That is what's going to be carried on. And that can be with your children or your siblings or your friends or with a community. Because what's left of you, your legacy, is your actions, of what you did for others. You know, one of the privileges I have is to conduct and officiate so many funerals. And most people at that time, the most important thing is not how much money they made or how big a house they had. It's how they treated people. It's what contributions they made to take care of others. It's what they did to sacrifice themselves for greater causes. It's about their piety. It's not putting down the striving and goals for material. It's important. Providing jobs, providing food on the table. This is also important. Giving tzedakah and charity isn't going to happen unless you strive. But in the end, Moses sets the standard. We all want to be buried ultimately, in people's hearts. Moshe is the most successful of all, that thousands of years later, he is buried in millions of people's hearts. So why don't we know exactly where he's buried? We do actually know where he's buried. He's buried in all of us. This Pesach, when we'll be separated, when life and death is so close with the virus, this is going to be different. But it is a clarifying time. What do we want our legacy to be? What do we want to pass on? What business is unresolved that maybe this is the time to start resolving it? What can we do to be more selfless and more concerned for those around us, both in our close circle, but even in the larger? Because that's what will carry on after we're gone. When we open that door for Elijah, I know who I wish would walk through that door. But the truth is, they already are at the table. Not in body, but in spirit, because they've passed so many things on to me. I feel blessed. I hold them every time I make the Kiddush, every time I take a bite of matzah. And that's the goal of everyone's life, is hopefully to have someone around our Passover table that even when we're not there, we're still there. Wishing everyone a beautiful day, a sweet day, a safe day as we prepare for Passover, those that practice. And may we, as we prepare even, hold those, the neshamas, the souls of those who are no longer with us, but on some level they absolutely are with us. Boker Tov.